We'll be looking at the two Koreas. Last year at this time, it looked like the proximate cause of World War III might be on the Korean Peninsula. Today, they joined their railway lines together and are hugging each other with a gusto I personally have never seen before. It looks like that the road to unity of the two Koreas is now open. And although the highway may be long, the destination is in little doubt, unless other people interfere. We'll be looking at the parlous state of Britain's relations with Russia and, from today at least, with China, because little Gavin Williamson, the fireplace salesman, piped up today. Don't tell him your name, Pike. And he's declared economic war on China, in step with the United States of America. Again, the proximate cause is Huawei, the mobile phone company, the telecoms giant, the second biggest in the world. I just drove past Waterloo and they've got the entire IMAX. The whole IMAX is covered in Huawei propaganda. Now, I've never used a Huawei. I'm quite happy, actually, with my Apple iPhone. But some people want Huawei out of the market. I understand why the United States did. Reasons of pure protectionism, to protect Apple and the other giants headquartered there. But I don't understand why Britain would want to join a trade war with China. But that's what Williamson did today. He warned that Huawei is actually spyware. This is particularly absurd, given that virtually every day the extent of the spying and the commercial subversion of data and of the customers unaware of the use to which their information is being put out and sold is being revealed. Every day almost. Facebook is in a scandal. Apple is in a scandal. Amazon is in a scandal. But it's Huawei who are the spies. And I've been thinking about what might lie behind this. In our case, it can't be protectionism because we don't have a dog in that fight. Here's my theory. Actually, phones and other telecommunications devices are very, very handy to spies. And if you have a Chinese dog in the fight over 5G, there's a real danger that the Chinese would get to know how much spying our telecommunications giants were allowing to go through their back door. And that's why the Five Eyes, the five white Anglo-Saxon Protestant countries of Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and last of all now, Britain, have joined the fight against Huawei. Now, it was one thing blustering and threatening and insulting little North Korea, which didn't have much of an ability to fight back. But picking a fight with China is really, really stupid, because by this time next year, China will be even closer to being the most important country in the world, economically, financially, militarily, and in almost every respect. So, when your country is about to leave the European Union, leave 27 European Union partners behind you to slip your moorings and sail off into the world, it might be a good idea to actually be making new friends in the world rather than new enemies. It's bizarre. David Cameron and George Osborne couldn't have been closer to China. In fact, both of them were earning a penny or two out of their knowledge of and good relations with China once they left office. And now, little Pike Williamson has ripped it all up and declared economic war on China. And as we saw on the arrest of the senior finance officer of Huawei in Canada at the behest of the US Justice Department, China fights back. So look out for retaliation for little Gavin Williamson's piping up on the subject today. I must reiterate that this is just my theory, of course. You may have a different one, and if you do, I want to hear from you. 0344 499 1000. If you disagree with me, your call, your email, your tweet will be prioritised. Of course, British-Russian relations were already in the tank. Although, as I keep saying to you, increasingly, you have to regard China and Russia as one thing, one item. They are definitely an item. They are in the tank because of many complex Cold War reasons. But the depth of our enmity between Russia and Britain, between Britain and Russia, was undoubtedly plumbed by the Scrapple affair. It's been some time since I've been able to turn to this subject. I'm grateful for the opportunity now to do so. I didn't pick the subject. I'm happy to deal with it because somebody somewhere has to draw a line in the steadily plummeting relations between Britain and Russia. Or where will it end? Somebody somewhere has to say, Russia is the biggest country in Europe. Moscow is the biggest city in Europe. The Russian economy is massive and getting bigger. We are, all of us on the European continent, dependent on Russian energy, particularly, of course, gas. It is foolish for both sides to continue digging this hole ever deeper. And whatever happened to the Scrapple affair? Whatever happened to the Scrapples? Whatever happened to the police investigation? Are we any further forward? Do we want to be? Or are we quite content to leave this issue up there like a totem on the shelf and use it as a reason why no meaningful relations exist now between Britain and Russia? We'll be going inside MI5, talking to Annie Machan, the former intelligence officer, about the Scrapple affair and where it stands. We'll be talking to Dr. John Hemmings, the director of the Asia Studies Centre at the Henry Jackson Society on the North and South Korea relations. And we'll be talking, of course, about Trump. Now, I believe that Trump has finally found a way to follow his instincts and his election campaign platform. He said, elect me and I will stop America being the world's policeman. Elect me and I will withdraw America from needless military engagements in far-off places of which we know little, he knew even less, and which are not in our interests to be involved in. And now he's done it. He's already pulled, how remarkably swift, American forces from eastern Syria. I just saw a helicopter picture of American forces being airlifted out of the area. And all those doomsayers who said that the Turks would fall upon the Kurds as soon as America withdrew its very few 2,000 soldiers from eastern Syria have been already confounded, because the Kurdish people, very cleverly and very correctly, have made their peace with Damascus, and the Syrian flag now flies in the towns vacated by the United States forces. And now, if Turkey invades to attack the Kurds, well, they'll have to fight Syria too, and Syria's allies, who carry quite a big stick. But 2019 might be the last year of Donald Trump's presidency. If all the propaganda that we've been fed about the Mueller inquiry turns out to be true, if the Steele dossier, you remember, those girls wetting themselves with the delight at meeting Donald Trump in a Moscow hotel room, and all of that, if all of that comes to pass, then it might be, given the change in arithmetic in the US Congress, that an impeachment of Donald Trump might just move forward. We'll be talking to Caleb Mopan, a journalist and political analyst, one of my favourite analysts of American affairs, later in the show. There are many other stories, of course, and you can bring them up. You can bring them up if you think I'm missing the big picture. Of course, we know, what's it called? It's not a national emergency. What's it called? It's called a major incident that 50 people crossed the channel. I would have thought on any given day there's more than 50 people crossing the channel. But give me your view. Is it a major incident? Is it an incident that you need to be concerned about? Or is it another look over there affair? You may think that the Brexit vote coming up in, well, how long? Not even 4 weeks from now is the big story already for 2019. I speak about that a lot. I'm ready to do so again. We're leaving the European Union, after all, in, nobody gave me the number, but it's certainly well less than 100 now, might even be less than 90 days away from our leaving the trading bloc that we have been in for the last 45 years. A significant event in anybody's language. You may think other issues too should be covered. Days until Brexit, my good friends have just given me it. It's 91 days and 4 hours away. Did it come from Russia with love, with hate, with animus towards the Scrapples, towards Britain, towards something else? What was it that happened in Salisbury? What do we know for sure? What do we not know? Or to paraphrase Donald Rumsfeld, what are the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns? By definition, you can't know the unknown unknowns, but you may have a theory about them. One thing's for sure, it gave a fairly brief bounce for Theresa May. She had diplomatic success in getting other governments to fall, however briefly, in line with her take and to act accordingly, expelling diplomats and so on. The Russian embassy in London, I'm told, is a bit of a ghost town. A huge number of Russian diplomatic staff were expelled. And there's now actually no meaningful diplomatic relations between Britain and Russia, although actually there have been very long stretches in history when that was so. Britain was at the forefront of opposition to the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. Britain sent an army which occupied a part of Russia to try and bring about regime change, and it's not even 100 years ago since that was forced to leave. There have been raids on quasi-diplomatic properties and so on. The security services spawned a whole generation of literature, Smiley's People and John le Carre and all of that. The Cold War was, of course, very fertile for fiction. How much of the Scrapple story is fact and how much might turn out to be fiction? To help me on that is Annie Machen, former MI5 intelligence officer, before a guest on the show, and a very well appreciated one too. Annie, thanks for joining us again.
My pleasure, George. Thanks for inviting me on.
Let's reprise the situation. Who's been kicked out of Britain? Who's been kicked out of Moscow? How does that affect diplomatic relations? Can you really have diplomatic relations if you're in a war of words like we and the Russians are?
It becomes increasingly difficult, of course. I mean, you can't really call it diplomacy anymore, where we have a situation where, without any actual hard evidence, very early on in the investigation into the Scrapple case, our Prime Minister stood up in Parliament and directly accused the Russians, where our mainstream media in the UK, within a couple of days of the attack, immediately accused the Russians. And then we had our government going round to all our allied countries and asking them to eject Russian diplomats. So I think over 20 countries did so at the UK's bidding, based on a narrative that had not been proven. So how diplomatic relations can recover from that is a very interesting question. They say, of course, that it's the relationships are in the deep freeze like they were during the Cold War, but I think it's probably worse than that.
Yeah, I think so. Now, of course, there was no hard evidence visible to the public in the early stages when the Prime Minister made her statement. However, latterly, there was hard evidence. There was hard evidence of 2 Russian citizens twice visiting Salisbury, 2 consecutive days. Not a very plausible, not to me at least, explanation of what they were doing there, and CCTV pictures and so on. How did that hard evidence alter, if it did, your perspective on the events?
Well, I found that alleged hard evidence frankly ludicrous. And I say that because one of the things that has never really been established is one, where the substance itself came from. Everyone immediately assumed it had to be Russia because it was a nerve agent that was developed under the Soviet Union back in the 1970s and has been out there in the wild for at least 2 decades, so it can be replicated by other states and other actors, and which indeed has been proven to have been under the auspices of no less than the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. So, many, many players have access to this. What we've been told is there's a lot of CCTV of these 2 alleged GRU agents, and yet there's very little CCTV of any of the victims of this alleged Novichok attack. So who are they? Who are they really? Who are they really working for? On whose instructions? Who stood to benefit from this? So it comes down to the motive. And frankly, I struggle, and I've always struggled with why on earth would Russia want to do something like this in such a spectacularly bungled and public way, when Scrapple was an agent who had been caught. He'd been convicted, imprisoned, pardoned, and released by the Russians. He would have been picked clean of any useful intelligence before they handed him over in the 2010 spy swap. And once he arrived in the UK, he would have been picked clean again by his MI6 handlers. So he was defunct as an agent. He had no intelligence value. So going back to the motive, one has to think, well, what might he have been involved in over the last 8 years since he was handed over to MI6 in the UK and pensioned off? And I think that's where the interesting questions are. There have been various theories reported in the UK press, most notably The Times, hinting that he might have been working with his former MI6 handler Pablo Miller, who also had gone on to work for Orbis Intelligence Limited, which is the company set up by Christopher Steele, a man who created the dirty dossier on Donald Trump. Was that some sort of connection, some sort of motive? Or could he have been working with organised crime or trying to investigate organised crime? Or indeed, it could have been a revenge attack carried out by rogue officers of the GRU. We just don't know at this point.
Let me ask you about the bungling, because that is one of the most mysterious aspects of the affair for me. If the British newspapers, and indeed the Commander Anti-Terrorism Squad at the Met, are correct, and there's no reason, at least in the latter case, to believe he's not correct, there were traces, minute, not sufficiently serious that the hotel had to be informed, of Novichok in a hotel room in a very run-down hotel in the East End of London, where it's therefore fairly clear that both of these men stayed when they were in England, which is a choice of hotel which is puzzling to me in the first place. The trace of Novichok is also puzzling, because that means it was in a container that was either leaking or had been opened in the hotel, and why so little of it? There were newspaper reports that they were not the best guests, not the best behaved guests, not to put too fine a point on it. Then there was the decision to travel by public transport rather than renting a car or being furbished with a car by the intelligence apparatus, as was presumably in England. And the gazing up at CCTV cameras, making no attempt to disguise whilst in Salisbury or indeed on public transport their identity. Then their reliance on the highly unreliable Sunday service on English public transport to make their exit from the country. All of these things are either the actions of real bunglers or all is not what it seems. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. One has to wonder if these are two patsies who've been set up to lay a fake trail. Particularly considering that in the early reports, every expert was being wheeled out from Porton Down to security experts, saying that Novichok was one of the most toxic substances ever developed as a nerve agent. It was 5 to 8 times more powerful than the VX agents that killed Kim Jong-un's half-brother in Malaysia only last year. So even if a minute trace had been found in that hotel, surely it would have killed these two bunglers from the alleged GRU. We don't know. But what I also find very interesting as well is the secondary accident where Charlie Rowley and Gordon Sturgis, who sadly died, apparently picked up a sealed scent bottle, apparently Nina Ricci or something. They found it in a bin, and it was sealed in cellophane, and yet they're saying that this was the discarded applicator that put this so-called gel on the doorknob of the Scrapple's house, which then led to their getting ill. So on the one hand, you have all these different theories about how this poison might have been applied, and then they say, oh, but we've got proof it was applied by this scent bottle, even though that scent bottle was then found by Charlie Rowley in a sealed, cellophane-sealed perfume box.
But he had to cut it open. However, bunglers do exist in your former service, and Russian ones too. There was the apparently extraordinary amateur attempt to mount a surveillance operation in The Hague, where ancient bugging material was in the boot of a car, which had to then be pointed. The boot had to be pointed at the building, and it was rumbled by Dutch intelligence at the time. So we can't rule out the fact that idiots are abroad involved in intelligence work, can we?
Absolutely not, no. And we can't also rule out the fact that there are rogue agents who take a plan into their own heads and go ahead with it without the knowledge of their bosses. That's something I can attest to from my time helping with the whistleblowing about MI5 and MI6 back in the 1990s. These things do go on. That's without doubt. What I find particularly interesting, though, is this build-up of the anti-Russia, this Russiagate narrative over the last couple of years. And it's been very carefully built up and very carefully played by the West, and it's wonderfully moved the attention from all the allegations of whistleblowers like Edward Snowden, which showed the endemic global panoptic surveillance that had been built up, particularly by the US NSA and by the UK's GCHQ, who were operating rogue from 9/11 right through to 2017 within the UK against all our citizens.
With no parliamentary approval. It's been
incredibly useful. Yeah,
no parliamentary approval. No, that's true. I just want to make it clear that present company accepted, sometimes intelligence people are more Austin Powers than James Bond. So we
Johnny English.
Johnny English, yeah. We can't use bungling as exculpatory factor entirely. But these two certainly were in a league of their own. You would have thought, wouldn't you, that if the GRU had been sent by the Russian state to carry out an assassination, it would have been done rather more professionally?
I would have expected something like that, yes. I mean, the assassination attempt against Alexander Litvinenko with a nuclear material, polonium-210, over a decade ago in London, obviously worked very successfully and did send a message. So in this case, one has to wonder exactly who these two people are, who they were working to whose orders, and were they rogue, or were they suborned by another actor, another state actor, say, like Ukraine or Georgia, who might have vested interest in attacking Russia's status in the world? Or were they, in the paid employ of organized crime gangs or something? We just don't know. And this is the problem, that we will never know because they will never be extradited. So what we have at the moment is a very convenient narrative created by the government and reflected in our mainstream media in the UK that then means that we never have to prove anything because people just have this vague memory now of some attack last March in Salisbury, and the narrative was it was the Russians, therefore the Russians are bad.
Will we ever know? I mean, it's extraordinary how this story, which was bestride us like a colossus for months, is now completely disappeared.
It has, yes. I don't think we will ever know, unless, of course, some wonderful new whistleblower comes out of the woodwork with proof to show exactly what went on, exactly what information the spies have, exactly what information the police have managed to pull together, and how much they've been told by the spies. And this is always the problem, that it's very easy for the spies working in the shadows to manipulate the mainstream media, to plant stories, to shift the narrative. And only this week we've seen another leakage of information about an organization called the Integrity Initiative. And this was a leak put out by the Anonymous Collective on the internet, showing that there is a government-funded program, the Integrity Initiative, to suborn people in the media and academia, and to get them to build up this anti-Russia narrative still.
I'm one of its victims, you may like to know. I'm in the documents. The good news is they have moved from a derelict mill near Achtermachte, where it can be cold at this time of year, and are now housed in the Rococo building in Temple, built by the owner of the Waldorf Astoria. So they're doing okay. They seem to have a decent budget. But leaving them aside for the moment, where do you think the Scrapples are?
I honestly don't know. I mean, one can speculate that they've been taken to another one of the Five Eyes countries, which is either the USA or Canada or Australia and New Zealand, given a new life. And these are the other four countries with a very close intelligence working relationship. But I think the key thing is that Scrapple was a highly valued agent for MI6 for over a decade. He got paid a lot of money for betraying the names of his fellow officers and agents. And they had a duty of care once they got him safely to the UK to look after him. And they manifestly failed to do that. So if I was someone, say, working in the GRU who was approached by MI6 now and saying, told, we'll give you all this money if you give us some secrets, I would be very wary. Not necessarily there would be reprisals from my bosses if I betrayed them, but even more so that if I successfully escaped, I would not be protected by the British intelligence agencies once I made it to the UK.
It is a bit odd that there wasn't even CCTV outside his house, considering the service he gave to the British intelligence services.
Well, perhaps there was, but it hasn't been released because it doesn't fit the official narrative. We just don't know. What is interesting, of course, is on the morning of the attack on the 4th of March, he and his daughter drove off and were seen driving off by various street CCTV cameras. They switched their mobile phones off so they didn't have GPS, and they disappeared off the radar for 4 hours. And I've never seen anything reported about what the intelligence agencies or the police think they might have been doing in that time. But what is crucial is that the alleged attackers, the GRU agents, only arrived in Salisbury on an 11:48 train. So they must have put the gel on the doorknob that the Scrapples apparently suffered from about 4 hours after the Scrapples had apparently left their home. So how on earth did they get the Novichok on their hands?
I wish
there
I
are
could.
A lot of holes in the official story.
I wish I could opine, but I can't. But I have in the past, and I think YouTube still has it. Lastly, then, is there any way out of this? Because let's say it happened. Let's say they were rogue agents. Let's say they were GRU. Let's say they were working rogue. Let's say whatever it is that they did backfired spectacularly, has caused a lot of trouble for Russia. What needs to happen now to reset relations with Russia? After all, we have had very difficult periods in the past, and then we had Mrs. Thatcher, no less, saying she could do business with the Secretary General of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Mr. Gorbachev. So, I mean, nothing is literally impossible to come back from. Shouldn't someone, especially as we're leaving the EU and in search of new markets and trading partners and so on, shouldn't someone somewhere be seeking that kind of a reset? Absolutely.
And I think it was very interesting in the run-up to the US presidential election in 2016 that Donald Trump, when he was candidate, made very strong positive statements saying he did want to do that. And as soon as he was elected, even before he was inaugurated, the CIA particularly and the general military-industrial complex were beginning to attack him and beginning to hedge him in to stop him doing this. And I think that the UK was implicated in that, not least with the dirty dossier created by a former MI6 officer called Christopher Steele, which must have had information from some of his former colleagues. And that has caused Britain massive diplomatic problems. And I think the fact that our Prime Minister, Theresa May, rushed so quickly in to blame Russia after the Scrapple attack is intensely damaging to our national interest. So it's very difficult to think how we can scrabble back from that, or how our allies who helped us in expelling diplomats can do the same thing too. But I think as well, Putin has shown a remarkable restraint in the retaliatory actions he's taken. And I hope he continues to do that, because if things spiral out of control anymore, I think we're looking at a very real possibility of this new Cold War becoming rather hot.
Indeed, and the adversary is many, many times more powerful than us. I mean, if you look at the media wars, for example, were Ofcom to put RT off the air, I believe that every journalist and broadcaster in Russia will be expelled from the country, and there will be no British journalists or media there at all, because the Russians may be becoming tired of President Putin's somewhat relaxed attitude to all these attacks. What do you say?
Absolutely. I mean, he's walking quite a tightrope, I think, where he has to seem responsible internationally, but it must be very difficult in the face of so much provocation. But he also has to be seen to be a strong man to his voters. I mean, it's a part of the Russian culture. But I think you're right about what might happen to RT. When this story broke, I remember very clearly the evening of March the 5th earlier this year, I was invited on to 2 programs that evening to commentate on it. First of all, RT. Secondly, BBC Newsnight. And I said exactly the same points on both shows. So for the first, on RT, I was then castigated as Putin's useful idiot, Kremlin stooge, all the rest of it. And yet for my what I said on the BBC, on Newsnight, I was praised for calling for restraint and going through the correct steps in order to investigate this attack. So it's very difficult to try and work out what will happen with the media in the UK. But I think, of course, there will be retaliatory steps if alternative news outlets like RT are banned from the UK. Then, of course, Putin's going to have to be seen to do something against the BBC office in Moscow, for example.
Well, I always say 2 things when I listen to you. The first is that every country needs intelligence services, and they need to be intelligent, smart, and accountable. And secondly, and not unconnected, I so wish you were still in there, Annie, because I'd sleep a lot safer at night if I thought our secrets were in your hands. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Annie Machen, former MI5 intelligence officer with a capital I. Andrew says on the SMS, didn't we once sail in boats to distant lands and assume control of indigenous populations? What goes round comes round. All the best for 2019. Well, not just because it's the first, that's the best SMS I might receive this evening. Thank you, Andrew. Brilliantly put. My old friend Mal in Belfast says, George, I think any rational person knows that if Trump has surrounded himself with the already proven guilty corrupts, then he himself is most likely to have been aware of their dealings. I fear that Trump will escape impeachment and fail to be toppled, but I think that Trump will eventually fall after he is president and be found as the biggest fraudster and corrupter the Americans ever put in office. Thanks for that, Mal. I'll tell you this. I saw a clip from Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, this very day. Look it up on YouTube. This very day, he said, it's a struggle. It's always been a struggle. It's always going to be a struggle right up until the rapture. Capital R. The rapture. That's the kind of people in power in Washington. They are looking forward to Armageddon. Some of them doing their best to bring it about. Here's one from, I don't know, it's anonymous. Could the motive be to send a message to anyone thinking about working with the Brits. It will never be forgotten or forgiven. And Concert Left Footer, what a brilliant, brilliant name. And a great, great picture. What might Huawei want to do in Britain? Rig the result of the X Factor? No Fu Manchu is itching to read everybody's Snapchat messages about Love Island. We are no longer even to own Gatwick, so there is now nothing else to read in Britain. That's a very, very fine tweet. Let's see if the first call matches up. It's Daniel in Addleston. Daniel, welcome.
Hi, good evening, George. How are you?
Well, thank you very much. The better for hearing from you.
Yeah, no, I wanted to speak about the Integrity Initiative.
Oh, and, yes, we touched on that with Annie Machen earlier,
yeah. Well, no, just to yourself and, people listening, I would ask that you check out the UK column and what David Scott had to say about it. I know lots of people are now, investigating this. I saw something today on YouTube with Max Blumenfeld about it.
He's a very fine man, I must say.
Yeah, he got a lot of stick for, well, madness. But, no, I mean, like with yourself, I know that you'll investigate these sort of things, and like I say, you're referenced in it, so you've got a stake in...
I do. I'm determined to get to the bottom of them.
I mean, as well, it seems to me that it's a very big thing, and we're only just now starting to scratch the surface.
Yes, and only thanks to Anonymous and their dump of information, and apparently they've got much more.
Well, hopefully as well, I don't know how it works, but appeal to these people to come forward. Because as well, one thing I did want to say actually is as well, according to that Sir Alan Duncan, the Home Office Minister, it was a hack. It wasn't a leak. It was a hack.
Could be. Anonymous do a lot of hacking, don't they?
Well,
it could be, but anyone who ever loses information in a leak is bound to describe it as a hack. But it might well have been a hack.
Well, I think as well, because as well in Commons, I think it was that it wasn't Chris Williams, it was the Dr. Julian Lewis, who was a Conservative, asked him, and he just replied that, going on previous behaviour or patterns of behaviour, therefore de facto it's Russians. So
they think Anonymous are Russians.
Well, I don't know. Maybe. But as well, no, I'm not implying that at all. What I'm saying is the government. Just de facto, it's the Russians. That's because as well in the Commons, this is from the Commons.
Well, Russia certainly benefited from the dump of data, no doubt about that, because
I think anyone
it reveals.
In fact, you could say that the European Union benefited from it because it makes the British look like a bunch of wallies.
Well, everybody benefited from it except us then. But I'll tell you why I don't think it was the Russians. And as far as I know, Anonymous exists all over the world. The reason I don't think it's the Russians is that whoever it was that dumped this material missed the most important pieces in the jigsaw. The dump concentrated on the Integrity Initiative's now admitted interference in the domestic politics of Spain, where they boasted about blocking the appointment of a Minister of Defense in the Spanish government that they didn't like on the grounds they thought he was too pro-Russian. That's what the dump concentrated on. But the big news was further down and was found by British people, namely that for the first time in my knowledge, which is quite extensive and expansive, for the first time ever, it was red-handed, the British government paying an organisation money which was using, in part, that money to attack opponents of the government in Parliament, particularly Jeremy Corbyn, but not only him, people around him, other members of Parliament, were attacked by tweet in public by a government-sponsored organisation, which is illegal in any democracy. You can't possibly allow it. Imagine if that became the norm, that any Western government gave money to people to attack their opponents in Parliament.
Where's the scrutiny in this, though? Where's the oversight, or whatever they call them, the regulators to
the defence and intelligence, the security and intelligence select committee is very trusty. Let me put it this way: you'd never find Chris Williamson being appointed to the Security and Intelligence Select Committee. You have to be those and such as those to be involved. But even they may have to examine this. I mean, it is literally illegal. It's utterly unconstitutional. It's probably the first time it's ever happened, or at least it's the first time it's been caught out as having happened. And the government should discontinue their support for an organisation so, at best, cavalier with normal democratic practice in Britain. You can't have the government giving money to people who then use it to attack the government's official opposition in Parliament.
No. Just quickly, George, before you cut me off, I'd like to wish you, your family, and everyone listening happy holidays, and hopefully we'll have a better 2019, and hopefully you get what you want.
Thank you, Daniel. God bless you and yours also. Ali in Southwark says, our British government and its Pike Defence Secretary seems to have too much pride and too much prejudice. Our so-called government is acting in a manner as though we have voted to remain 2 years ago, and losing ties with Russia and China will have no consequences whatsoever. Can Britain not also see this may affect trade with every BRICS nation in the process? It is embarrassing to call ourselves British in these times. Well, Ali, I must say it's genuinely inexplicable to me. If I were running the British government, I would say we're about to leave 27 countries behind. It's been very acrimonious, and there's bound to be a net loss of warmth and fraternity with those countries. So let's try and make friends around the world. Let's try and be neutral in great political controversies around the world, so that we can trade here and there, so that we can trade with countries that look one way and trade with countries that look another. That just seems to me obvious common sense, but we are doing the precise opposite. Now, as I told you, it's not an anti-Tory point, because Cameron and Osborne did everything that they could, including bringing the President of China for a state visit in an open carriage, riding down the Mall. Yeah, this is not an anti-Tory point. But Gavin Williamson has today declared economic war on China, and there will be retaliation. I'll be right back. So we're reviewing 2018. We're looking forward to 2019. Trouble on the horizon, trouble with China, trouble with Russia already extant. The Chinese development seems to be a turn by the British government, unless Gavin Williamson was talking out of turn. Britain has invested a very great deal in Anglo-Chinese relations, even bringing the President of China here and billeting him with Her Majesty the Queen. So let's discuss that turn. Is it in our national interests? I believe not. Not because I'm pro-Chinese. I'm not pro-Chinese. I've never been pro-Chinese, ever. I believe in Britain, and I want Britain to be a player everywhere, especially after 91 days and 3 hours from now, when we're no longer in the European Union. I want us to be able to sell our language, our culture, our goods, our services all over the world. I don't want our government to dig us into needless confrontations. After all, we don't even have a dog in this fight. We don't have a trade deficit with China that is deeply troubling the policymakers in London in the way that the Americans do in Washington. We are not in hock to the Chinese. We are not in global competition with the Chinese. We don't own any major telecoms companies. We don't compete with Huawei, the mobile phone, which I'd never heard of actually until this started, because I'm quite happy with my Apple phone. But we don't make a competitive product. So why are we getting into a fight with China over it? I think it's a legitimate question, and it's a British question. It's not a communist question. It's not a pro-Chinese question. It's a British question. And I've got some more for you. I've just been writing, if you follow my written work, you'll see the piece I did yesterday about the fact that The Times, sister newspaper of this radio station, revealed over Christmas that a whole raft of ISIS fighters had somehow mysteriously made their way to the Ukraine and are now in the front line at Mariupol as fighters with the right sector, clue being in the name, followers of Nazi Germany, people who carry the banners of collaborators with Nazi Germany who massacred Ukraine's Jewish population. We're talking about a right sector which has the SS, Wolf's Hook, as its emblem. And they are now in command of a very large group of Islamist Chechens who have somehow made their way there, you might speculate how, from Syria and Iraq. And whose side are we on in this conflict? Yes, you guessed it. 0344 499 1000. These are the big questions of the day. The Communicipalist, one of my best correspondents, says Putin apparently is criticised at home for not being forceful enough with the West and failing to anticipate or preempt what are perceived in Russia as provocations by NATO. Why would we play such a dangerous game? Who benefits from such risk-taking? Well, very well parsed, and absolutely the point that I'm trying to make, though in fewer words. Very well said indeed. Let me give you another Gavin Williamson story. Gavin Williamson is dispatching a Royal Navy survey ship, having earlier sent ships to the South China Sea, clue being in the name, to the Azov Sea, which is Russian territorial waters, to back up the aforementioned Ukraine in their standoff with Russia. Why? Why? What's in that for us? And if I was Putin, I would sink it. If a British Royal Navy ship sailed into the Azov Sea in the current climate, I would sink it if I was Putin. And what are we going to do about it? Are we going to war with Russia? With its multi-thermal, nuclear, warheaded missile fleet? Really? Really, Gavin? Why are we doing this kind of thing? Again, I'm not saying this because I love Russia. I'm saying it because I love Britain. Why is Britain getting involved with one survey ship being sent to Russian waters to bolster Ukraine? What is this all about? And Putin is criticised in his military, in his intelligence apparatus, for just taking all these provocations and not striking back. Hassan Diwan says, off topic, but daughter was curious, if your mother is the mother of all talk shows, who's the father? Well, if I ever leave here, maybe I'll launch the father of all talk shows. Let's hear from John in Gravesend. Go ahead, John.
Very good evening, George. A few quick points, because I just get so annoyed at our concept of Russia. One, we have Western manufacturers in Russia producing cars. The fourth and fifth biggest producers of cars are VW and Ford. The 500,000th Polo car has just come off the production line this year. Mercedes Sprinter came off the production line in 2013. There are over 600 McDonald's restaurants.
In Russia?
In Russia.
Yeah, it's a normal capitalist country. I don't know why other capitalist countries can't just get along with it. Is that not what capitalism's meant to be? Trade with each other, everybody makes?
Yeah, but Russia's more capitalist than us now. German trade with Russia went up 19% last year. Sorry, 21%.
Good point.
Russian trade with Germany, this is with sanctions, went up 19%. Let's talk about Britain punching above its weight. Britain's gold reserves are 320 tons between Kazakhstan and Lebanon. Russia, 2,000 tons. Debt to GDP, UK, 85% debt to GDP. Russia, 23. And you can go on and on and on. The highest wheat producer in the world, Russia. It's got oil and gas coming out of this end into Europe. It's got oil and gas going into China. It's got oil and gas going south onto Turks Stream. This is the country we should be trading with. The Germans are doing it. The Italians.
Well, that's a good point, John. It's a good point you've made there. This dichotomy. I contradicted someone on television, an American TV interviewer earlier this evening before I came here, because she kept saying the West, the West, the West, but it isn't the West, because Germany's in the West, France is in the West. Germany has just said there is no evidence that Huawei is being used for spyware, being used for intelligence gathering. That's the German government, the biggest, most powerful capitalist government in Europe. So if Germany doesn't think so, why do we think so? If Germany doesn't want economic war with Russia, why do we want it?
We're hoping to get a deal with the Americans. Now, we're 37. I think we're 37 billion in profit with our trade with America.
Yeah.
If Trump
that's good. I want that too.
He's going to want to cut that. So maybe an input into the NHS by American insurance companies might be a way of softening it so we can get a good deal. I don't want us to have only one friend left in the world, which is the United States.
Especially one that's looking decidedly rocky. They might be about to overthrow their president.
But the main point I'm trying to get over tonight is that, the West, the private companies are trading in Russia. Russia imported American cowboys actually to raise the beef because they don't because they're fed on organic crops. Russia has banned genetically modified food. Only today it's been announced Putin has put in an Animal Protection Act. That's regards looking after them, petting, breeding them for sale. All of this stuff. There's such a side to Russia, and our media will.
Well, I mean, these statistics you're giving me, obviously I can't confirm them, but if true, they are further grist to my mill, John. That what could be a huge opportunity for us in the post-Brexit era is turning into, as you say, one friend left in the world, and that friend is decidedly shaky individual.
Us too, UK and the US and its Premier Poodle represent the international community.
Well, I never accepted that.
I know.
Since Mr. Ben said, I've just learned that I've met half the international community. I've met Tony Blair. Because these people arrogate to themselves that they, first of all, are the international community. Secondly, that they are the West, when they're nothing of the kind. France is doing roaring business with Russia. Germany, even more so.
Well, France is now trying to get involved in a wide-bodied airliner. I think there's an MC-100 that's going on sale. Russia builds whole planes, whereas we just do the wings of the Airbus. An Italian company is now trying to get involved in the development of LNG gas in the Arctic. You've got the Trans-Siberian Railway from China right the way through to Europe and the UK. There's so much going on, and it's going on in the east and not in the west.
Well, that's a fact. The sun is rising in the east and setting in the west, and we better act clever, box clever, if we're not going to be.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you. It was a very interesting call, John. Thank you very much indeed for it. Any father that takes their child to a Motown show deserve so much honour and respect. For a child of the 21st century to experience such timeless classics will be very beneficial. Motown is the Mensa of the music industry. My favourites are My Girl and Marvin and Tammy duet classics. Smokey Robinson and Jackson 5 are not far off. All those beautiful tracks. It is a remarkable industry, which he set up in a house, Berry Gordy. He had been working at Ford in Detroit for 3 years, and he got sacked. He was a worker. And as he put it, he used to see sheet metal coming in one door and a car going out the other. And he thought, that's what we should do with music. At that time, most white radio stations would not play black music. They called it black music. And radio stations for black music, of course, existed. But the dichotomy was almost perfect, even in the North, never mind in the South of the United States. When Motown went on tour, which they very bravely did, to places like Atlanta and other places, the audiences were segregated. Whites here, blacks there. No mixing, the police would say, as they swung their night batons at anyone who disregarded them. A shot was fired at the artists on stage in the Motown Roadshow. Dr. King was proselytizing in the streets for civil rights. Jack Kennedy was being murdered. Then Dr. King was murdered. Then Senator Kennedy was murdered. And race war was endemic and periodic in the United States. The Ku Klux Klan, lynchings and so on. And along comes this guy who makes a factory, a music factory, where talented young black people come in one door and recording artists, many of them stars, go out the other door of a house in Motown, Detroit, Michigan. It's a fantastic success story. Now, a lot of people fell out and many of the acts left, and it's said that Berry Gordy didn't pay people as much as they would have earned elsewhere in the mainstream, if you like. And of course all of that is probably true, though I don't know the details. But what has been left? 2 decades, more than, but 25 years of tip-top record production, and names, songs, tunes that we'll never forget, that are giants in the entertainment business. Now, I grew up, if you think about it, I was born in 54, so I was 16 going on 25 in 1970. So all of my teenage years and all of my young adult years had Tamla Motown as the soundtrack, and there was a song, an artist for everything. I remember being so moved by these kind of songs, these love songs in 3 minutes. And of course, I'd never met any black people then, but I was in love with Diana Ross. Not so much later when she became a diva, but when she was on the Supremes, I totally loved her. And Marvin Gaye, what's not to love? Could there have been a smoking hulk anywhere like Marvin Gaye? And what about Smokey Robinson, who turns out to have written almost all the big hits, including My Girl that Ali in Southwark has just referred to, which, by the way, is the highlight of the Motown show in London. Really the highlight, and there are many, many highlights. Stevie Wonder. By the way, if you've got 5-10 minutes to spare, I'm not a big fan of James Corden, but my eldest son is. And he showed me last night when we got home James Corden in a car with Stevie Wonder. It's absolutely magic. It's magical. Stevie's happiness, infectious happiness, his voice. James Corden actually moved to tears when Stevie rings James's wife and sings, "I just called to say James loves you." Oh, it was just marvellous, magical. You must look it up. I better get on with my job. Here is Kate Mann. George, I'm so frustrated. I'm currently in Switzerland and can only get BBC and CNN news on TV. Oh dear. Having to rely on Twitter and YouTube for the truth about things. Damn the deep state and all its minions. Thank you, Kate. I know how you feel. Frankly, being in a hotel room with only CNN on the television is much, much, much worse. Believe me, and that's happened to me many, many, many times. But on Twitter, I'll tell you what, I was sitting here with the lovely Penny Smith just before the show began, and breaking news came on the BBC about a heinous terrorist attack at the pyramids in Egypt, which has killed 2 Vietnamese tourists and wounded many others, and a terrible blow to the tourism industry in Egypt. But I already knew about it 20 minutes before off Twitter. Twitter is the fastest place for news you'll ever get. We're looking east in particular at the rapprochement between North and South Korea. As I said earlier, at the top of the show, this very day, they joined their railway lines together, which seems quite a permanent kind of thing. Not everyone, of course, is happy about this rapprochement. Not everyone believes it will last. And so we thought we'd get an expert on. Dr. John Hemmings is an expert. He's Director of Asia Studies at the Henry Jackson Society, and he's kindly agreed to join us now this evening. Dr. John, thank you for that.
Thank you.
Now, last year at this time, many, including me, thought that war might break out on the Korean Peninsula. Now it's like the winter of love. Tell us what you think of that.
Well, it's been an extraordinary year. I think everybody has noted, I think the most significant feature of it has been diplomatic versatility. The North Koreans being very, very versatile, very fluid, willing to reach out to South Korea's initial overture to come to the Winter Olympics of last year, which they sent a team to. And the South Koreans, of course, pushing under Moon Jae-in. But even Donald Trump, not to compliment him too much, but he turned on a dime and went from war rhetoric to meet, talk not war. And although there's a lot of question within expert circles about whether or not the agreement in Singapore actually means anything, and if there's any real meat in the future of the talks, the fact is that conflict for the moment has been put to one side, and there is some sort of diplomatic process. But that, too, is also very fluid. So we've had fluid diplomacy, but the problem is that everything's so fluid, it's hard to know where it will go next.
I think Donald Trump deserves quite a bit of credit, actually, for the Korean breakthrough.
I agree.
He, in a way, if there's a Trump method, that was the method in action, wasn't it? A lot of bluster, a lot of muscle showing, but then flexibility to reach the deal. That's his. Yeah. If he does have a modus operandi, that's it, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think the thing that was impressive for people like myself who've watched North Korea for a long time is that, with the Chinese, they've always had a kind of, I think, a large amount of leverage that they've been unwilling to use. And by threatening conflict and also, putting secondary sanctions on Chinese banks that were doing heavy business with North Korea, he made it an American problem into a Chinese problem. And suddenly, once the Chinese became bothered about it, the North Koreans came running to the table. So I think that part he understood very correctly as a businessman. He knew where North Korea's income is coming from. Yes.
Now, Trump is meeting Kim again. Is it in January, February? It's quite soon anyway. And North Korea said that it would allow inspectors to the nuclear site. So these seem to suggest that whatever happened in Singapore, it is going to continue.
One hopes so. I mean, the talks haven't. I think they're supposed to be in Washington. They haven't been confirmed yet. But certainly the fact that there's no talk of stopping them, and there's no, the arguments aren't going the other way, and we haven't seen the military exercises resume, indicate that both sides are still proceeding carefully. I think the South has been pushing very hard to lead the North Koreans towards economic prosperity as a kind of leverage to get them to get rid of the nuclear weapons. I think one of the things that a report we did for our think tank this year that was very surprising for a lot of us was the realization that the North really wants to economically reform. It's seen what China has done. It's maintained one-party control whilst becoming rich. And I think that's now, the one bit of leverage that we have is that the U.S. can invest in North Korea and open up the international community. Of course, the North Koreans don't just want Chinese investment. But the question, of course, is do they want their cake and to eat it? Do they want to get rid of the nuclear weapons? And for that, we are seeing some small signs, but I haven't seen any big things on the table yet.
Now, North Korea is, of course, potentially vastly rich in minerals and precious materials of all kinds. It has a huge and disciplined, hardworking labor force. It has stability in the way that China has it. The potential for North Korea to become like China is considerable, isn't it?
Oh, I mean, the Koreans, absolutely. I mean, South Korea is, you might argue, not a complete country, and it's the 11th, 10th largest economy in the world. So absolutely, the Koreans are very industrious, very hardworking, and can do much with little. So if the North Koreans were to allow economic reform and to proceed down that line, presuming, it's a big assumption, but if they were, I wouldn't be surprised if they were to grow very quickly.
Any Nobel Peace Prizes in the ether? I mean, I would have thought that both the Korean leaders are in the running for that, or ought to be.
There absolutely has been talk about it. Moon Jae-in, of course, has been the most favorite amongst people like ourselves. But I have to say, there's still the issue of human rights, and it's one of those ones where it's a lose-lose either way. There was a UN report in 2014 which came out with some of the political camps where they still have something like 180 to 200,000 political prisoners in terrible conditions. So, one of the things that I think we've come to realize very gradually is that any deal that occurs that includes economic reform is going to have to push the North Koreans down that road to getting rid of the most egregious human rights issues. And that's a big if. But even then, avoiding conflict and avoiding a horrific war on the peninsula would certainly be at least one point in the steps toward the Nobel Prize.
I think, I mean, it's encouragement. It's carrot rather than stick. Sticks don't really work with the North Korean leadership, I wouldn't have thought. I've been there a couple of times. You can see what it's got going for it, but you can also see, as you say, egregious human rights issues and poverty there, although not as poor as some people make out. There have been periods of famine. They took me to a factory that made cakes made of grass and expected me to be impressed that their people were eating grass, albeit in cake form. So, I mean, you can see the potential. And if there's a highway now opening up, it's a long one, but isn't the end point a bit like the Hong Kong solution, one country, two systems?
Well, I mean, that's perhaps not the best of parallels, because at the moment a lot of people in Hong Kong say that system is breaking down. But you're right. I mean, in principle, the South Koreans, I think, would be open to a federal system where neither side rules, but it's a single nation. But it has a divided, perhaps a binary political system. A lot of that's pretty far off into the distance and would require a huge amount of preliminary negotiations. Certainly, you did see during the Olympics a lot of surprising pan-Korean nationalism on the southern side. And you saw, actually, even that very short visit when Kim went over into the joint security area, huge outpouring of enthusiasm in Seoul. So I think there's, especially amongst the young generation, they're quite enthusiastic for this to be resolved.
Yeah, I mean, I think Korean nationalism is a really vibrant force, and it defines itself quite often. You may have found yourself as an expert, more than me, defines itself against Japan, which committed horrific, heinous acts against the peoples of all the Korean peninsula. And They're very much an independent and quite special people, I think.
Absolutely. We'll see. I'm hoping that this year we'll see more in terms of detail. I mean, what we may want to look for in terms of the next meeting between Kim and Trump is an actual, what they would say would be a kind of timeline or some sort of process by which sanctions begin to be removed and reciprocated by the removal of weapon systems. And it may not be laid out in advance. It might go piece by piece. The six-party talks attempted this, so we shouldn't be too, jubilant. It might break down at some point. There's always a huge trust deficit between the two. Yeah. But certainly if we see that sort of process laid out in the next meeting, then we have some cause for positivity, I'd say.
Well, I might be a long way off, Doctor, but they joined the railway lines together today, and that's at least a good first step for travelling a long journey. Dr. John Hemmings, thank you very much indeed for joining us, Director, Asia Studies Centre at the Henry Jackson Society. Not to the liking of all, of course. This is from Graham from Fort William. George, you say your show is the last free speech in the media. What utter lies. All the callers have to agree with your views. If they don't agree with your views, you never let them speak and shout down at them. If I called up and said a positive view about Trump, you'd flip on me. That's why I'd never call. You're a bully, a telephone gangster. You're a very bigoted, nasty man. Not everyone shares your small-minded views. Get therapy and admit that you're jealous of Trump. Yes, I'm jealous of Trump's tiny dino hands. I'm jealous of his little mushroom. I'm jealous of his, well, how shall I say, his special skills with ladies. Actually, I said quite a positive thing about Trump, more positive than the Henry Jackson Society, not 5 minutes ago. But thanks for listening, Graham, and thanks for spending 25 pence on sending me that text. You're obviously not listening closely enough, though, because in every segment, I beseech those who disagree with me to call up. I beseech them. Let me put it in smaller words, Graham. I beg them to call me. And we call you back. I mean, you've spent more money on that text than it would have cost you to phone. So why don't you, Graham, in Fort William, screw your courage to the sticking post? I never quite knew what that meant, actually. Nail your courage to the sticking post. Something like that. And give me a call. Here's the number, 0344 499 1000. And I'll overlook the defamatory insults in your SMS. Bob Justice says, the last free space in the mainstream media is trending. The moat's unshackled. I've not heard a peep about the Scrapples anywhere else. We had weeks of it. People accused of being Russian bots. Then nothing. It's only us who cares. Happy New Year, Julia and Sergei. Now, that's the second person who's told me that we're trending. Might be that nobody's on Twitter tonight because they're all out at parties. But I need you to call me. Otherwise, it's going to be a quiet show. I need woman callers because we mustn't be an all-male environment. We need new callers. If you haven't called before, this is the perfect night to do it. We need callers who disagree with me as well as callers who agree with me. So let me accentuate the number, 0344 499 1000. And here's one of our regulars, and a very fine man too, Mohammed in Maidenhead. Go ahead, Mohammed.
Hello, George. How are you?
By the grace of God, I'm good. What would you like to say?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say it was really good to meet you in Nottingham. So thank you very much.
Marvellous. We took a nice picture together, I recall.
Yes, it was amazing. I keep looking at the picture, George. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Second of all, just wanted to talk about China. Hawaii, I can't say it right, but it's
apparently it's Huawei.
Huawei,
yeah.
There we go. I actually was in China, in Shenzhen, where the headquarters for Huawei is.
Oh, yeah.
And I was teaching English out there, and I can tell you that they're really warm and accommodating towards the Brits.
Yeah, quite surprising, really. It amazes me as I go around the former empire on the case of China, the place we used to bombard because they refused to allow us to sell heroin in their country. How nice they are to us, yeah.
Yeah, they were really, and also like all the metro stations, they have a minute, like all the announcements are in English as well, like to make way for those who are from abroad.
Are they? I didn't know that. I'll tell you what, I did a speaking tour of Japan once, and one of the most alienating things for me was not hearing or seeing any English or Latin letters at all. So all the advertising boards, everything, of course, in Japanese. No English words, no English television, no. And I was alone, travelling alone. I found it very alienating. So I'd like to have heard in English the underground metro announcements.
Yeah, absolutely, George. Obviously, in Japan, it sounds very alienating, like you're saying. But in China, they're so warm and welcoming, and like all the staff that I was working with in the schools were really welcoming as well. So basically, I think that we should give trust to China, give trust to Huawei, because when you get trust by giving trust, that's what my dad's always said. You get trust by giving trust. And I think at the moment, what's his name, Gavin Williamson?
Yes, the Defence Secretary. Don't tell them his name.
Right. I think that he's making a big mistake because, he's just breaking the trust with China, which is not really. And also, the company Huawei has said in the news that they wouldn't, use it for spyware or anything, or cooperate with the government.
Well, look, all as has been pointed out to me in the course of this show, all telephone systems, all telephone sets, what an old-fashioned word, can be used for spyware. I've got no reason to believe that Huawei is any more or less likely to use their equipment, their apparatus for intelligence gathering than any other of these telecommunications giants. And perhaps that's the problem. It is only my theory, but my theory is this, that they don't want Huawei in the 5G market because it will make it more difficult to use the telecoms giants for spying purposes, as they almost certainly do right now.
Absolutely. No, I completely agree with you, George. I do completely agree with you. But, thank you very much for taking my call. I really don't, I think I've said everything that I could.
It's a pleasure to talk to you, and it was to meet you, Mohammed. Stay in touch in the course of the next 12 months if I'm still here. Thank you very much indeed for that. Lots of calls now and messages coming in. Thank goodness, because there's still an hour and a quarter to go, but let's take a break. The Communicationist says post-Brexit UK on WTO rules needs to connect to China's Belt and Road Initiative, the new Silk Road and riches of the Orient. New opportunities to link to the biggest deal in the history of world trade means Brexit is not Little England, it's big, wide world. My views entirely. The Red Resistance says, the thing about this integrity initiative issue for me is this: A, the total lack of recognition in the mainstream media, and B, as someone who's followed politics very closely for a number of decades, I feel confident this should have brought the government down. I might go back to that subject if I get time later. And Hassan says, the reason we're fighting with China is because our overlords in the Pentagon are fighting with it. And Andy Jefferson says, do I detect a new government ploy in saying there is a major incident starting up in the Channel? It will be used to further Theresa May's Brexit plan. 8 people in a boat isn't major. Hashtag we're being invaded. Well, here's Fra in the north of Ireland, from whence my own ancestors invaded. Fra, welcome to the show.
Good evening, George. Fantastic to speak to you in the cusp of another year.
Another year. Let's hope we're still here at the cusp of the next one, Fra.
You'll last forever, George. You really will, man.
Thank you, my friend.
George, just 2 quick comments. One of them is I'd like to wish you and Gatry and all your family, and I'm sure every listener who follows you on all the social media, is going to wish you all the best for the coming year.
Thank you.
And on a second quick note, George, as a working man, I was out on Christmas Day working in a taxi for about 8 hours, and I donated half of those wages towards your raising money on Kickstarter.
For the Killing Kelly film. Thank you, Fra. That's very, very, very kind of you.
You're very welcome, George. I knew that as a working man, you'd probably appreciate that more than anything.
I do, yes. That's the equivalent of the widow's mite. Half a worker's wages is a remarkably generous thing to do. Thank you.
Absolutely. But just to congratulate you on raising the
we did. We got 60.
You know,
we asked for 50. We got over 60. And there are people... actually, it's... You know how sometimes you hit the zeitgeist?
Yes.
We've got one of the world's most celebrated and famous composers to do the music. I won't say who that is right at this moment.
Yes,
but recognised by everyone.
Producer.
We've got Sean Murray, the celebrated Irish film director. But we're getting all kinds of people coming on board now, not just offering services, offering investment, offering distribution deals. My old friend Victor Lewis Smith, the genius, offering to help with the music and so on. It's really building up steam, and I can't wait to start filming, actually.
No, and I can't wait to be in the audience when it's premiered, because I've been promised a ticket as one of the...
You'll always be in any premiere of mine, Fra.
Oh, thanks very much, George. And that's on the back of, I would imagine, the killings of Tony Blair. That was such an incisive, actually,
I'm doing this killing trilogy. It seems the killings of Tony Blair, killing Kelly, and the next one will be Who Killed Cock Robin, about Robin Cook. So there you go.
Oh, right, yes, very good. Well, the truth will out, George. I thought it was fantastic what you were saying about the Ukraine. I actually read an article that you'd written, or something that you'd spoken on.
I wrote a piece that I've just retweeted it, actually. So if people are following this on Twitter, they can read it now.
Fantastic. George, I actually had the privilege of going to the People's Republic of Lugansk on the 11th of November this year. I was one of the international monitors at the election, so obviously I have an interest in the area and the subject. And when I read what you'd said and what you detailed earlier on about, Chechnyan rebels or terrorists or whatever, the different terminology.
Well, some of them are Chechen, but some of them are Uyghur, some of them are Libyan. Basically, it's just for those that don't know what I'm talking about. Let me recap it quickly. The New York Times 3 years ago did a major report on the presence of Islamic State, as they like to call it. I still call it ISIS myself. The presence of ISIS on the front line in Ukraine, fighting against the Russian-speaking people of eastern Ukraine, and ultimately their ultimate goal, of course, to fight Russia itself. And the Times, this last weekend, the sister paper of Talk Radio, of course, the Times revealed or confirmed the presence of this Sheikh Mansour Brigade of long-bearded Islamist fanatics from every part of the Muslim world who have somehow managed to get to eastern Ukraine and have uniforms and weapons and are under the command of, the Times didn't say this, but the New York Times did, under the command of the right sector, the ultra-nationalist Ukrainian formations, the SS-type worshippers. Now, if that isn't an unholy alliance, I really don't know. Anyway, over to you.
Yes, it's quite scary in many respects to see that people of completely diverse political, religious and geo-global kind of outlooks. You have the right-wing fascist coup that I believe took over in the Ukraine, kind of in bed with fundamentalist Islamic jihadist head choppers who are there just for the pure hatred of the Russian nation and in order to foment its own agenda going forward. I always thought that the reason why Putin, it's my personal opinion here, the reason why Putin went into Syria was in order to prevent ISIS, had they been successful in Syria, and I believe backed by the West, and I would include Britain and France and Germany in that going forward, that their idea was to destroy Syria and then have this Islamic army then march into Chechnya and onto the Russian borders. Hence, all the Russophobia you've had around Scrapple that you mentioned earlier, and everything that goes along with that, putting pressure on what's left of kind of the Russian Caucasus.
It's just not in our national interest, this. It is not in our national interest for Islamist fanaticism to grow. That any normal person in the street, if you went out and asked them, would say that. That's not in our interest. So whether our policy has deliberately or inadvertently strengthened the hand of Islamist fundamentalists, it should be reversed. And that's a view I will take to my grave whenever it comes. But the policy of my enemy's enemy is my friend is, of course, a very long one. Britain supported the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt against President Nasser. Western countries and Israel supported the development of what became Hamas against Arafat. They supported the obscurantists in the civil war in the 60s in Yemen. We have a long history, and it always fails. It repeatedly fails, yet it is repeatedly repeated.
George, I'll use your very own analogy that I read in your article of Frankenstein.
Yes.
That people have created this Frankenstein-esque monster, which they are now going to release on. They've released it on the Middle East. They're trying to release it onto the Russian borders. And we have no idea where ultimately this is going to lead both the West, who may or may not be inextricably linked to these different groups. But it's a very frightening future when humanity and human life has absolutely no value when it comes to exploitation of an imperialist agenda and global politics and any part of the world where they seek to have regime change, steal the resources, or move forward with a political military agenda. Well,
look, it's been fascinating touring the eastern Ukraine with you, and thank you for all your kind words and your support down the years. And actually on the screen now I have a tweet from you. China has access to 80% of the minerals essential for drones, smart technology and phones which American companies like TechMet are lobbying to get control of. China jointly extracts these along with the host nation, hence the pressure from Gavin and co. Yeah, but I accept all that, but that's a reason for actually being friendly with China, not being unfriendly with China. David Leviscott says, "Hi Gigi, we're all living in a construct engineered by elites to control and extract wealth from the many and distribute amongst the privileged few. The construct feeds on your life." That's a bit over my head, that one, Dave. Britain will fly a drone over the Kremlin. That'll straighten Putin right. Whatever happened to the Gatwick Airport drone? Are we ever going to hear a conclusion to that? I mean, tens of millions of pounds were lost, hundreds of thousands of holidays were ruined. It utterly dominated the news agenda. People were falsely accused, their faces and names and address plastered across the newspapers, and then silence? Seriously? I just don't understand the British media. I don't understand British journalists. If I was a journalist, I would feel it a matter of honour to follow this story until I got to the bottom of it. Not least because I'd been persuaded to write acres of copy on it in the previous few days, and now the police tell us there might not even have been a drone. Did I just hear that correctly? That the Royal Mail issued a stamp commemorating D-Day, which was the US and British landing in Normandy, illustrated by a picture of US Marines wading ashore in a completely different part of the world. My goodness, even the Royal Mail is malfunctioning. This, though, is working perfectly. It's the mother of all talk shows.
The mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
This is a good deal.
On Talk Radio.
Now, notwithstanding the frankly abusive tweet or text rather that I read out from Graham in Fort William, I do have a good word to say about Donald Trump. I did say, you'll recall, dear listeners, that I'm not happy that Donald Trump is the President of the United States, but I'm extremely happy that Hillary Clinton isn't. And I said repeatedly, if Trump did what he claimed in his election campaign he would do, both domestically and internationally, then America would be the better for it, and so would the rest of the world. Now, largely, he has not. But in the last 7 days, he has. He has declared an end and actually finished the U.S. military occupation of northeastern Syria. And I saw helicopters helicoptering out the American forces earlier this day. Pretty quick work, actually. He has also declared that he's pulling the American forces out of Afghanistan. A fat lot of good they've done there. They've been there for 17 years. That's 3 times the length of the Second World War. Well, not quite, because the Americans didn't enter the war until later, but that's another matter. A sore point, but another matter. The reality is that these foreign forces in Afghanistan are completely unnecessary and counterproductive and extremely expensive, and Trump is going to pull them out too. Now, this has created the most, well, I think, a hybrid of obscene proportions, a hybrid of liberal, leftist, progressive attacks on a Republican president for ending a war, and the deep state and the military-industrial complex who need that war, and they need it to go on forever and ever, if possible. They've formed a front, a bloc. You've got the beast with 2 backs, with the liberal, pussy-hatted progressives, and the generals and the CIA men on the same side, denouncing Trump for ending a war. Now, I may have got all of this completely wrong. Joining me is one of America's best journalists and political analysts. He's Caleb Maupin. He's in San Francisco, but he's on the line now. Caleb, thank you very much for joining us.
Sure. Glad to be here.
Did I summarize the situation accurately or not? And if not, set me right.
I think you're absolutely correct. And the level of division that we're seeing in American politics these days is astronomical. Once again, the federal government is shut down. Donald Trump is calling for funding for his wall to stop immigration. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party is criticizing him for pulling out of Syria, saying that we've abandoned the Kurds and abandoned the women of Afghanistan, and accusing him of being disrespectful to the military. It is a political fight in Washington, D.C., in which there's pretty clearly big divisions, but both sides seem to not be exactly clear about what they want.
There's a famous song long before you were born, clowns to the left of me, jokers to the right. Here I am, stuck in the middle with you. That's what this situation sounds like to me, that you've got a right-wing Republican president, offensive in many, many ways, doing the right thing, and being attacked by 2 apparently polar opposites of political opinion, even though he's doing the right thing.
Sure. Now, Trump was widely criticized for the way he responded to the killing of the journalist Khashoggi by Saudi Arabia. And you'll have to remember that during his campaign, he, widely criticized Saudi Arabia on the campaign trail, called out Hillary Clinton for her ties to Saudi Arabia. Well, lo and behold, now he's defending Saudi Arabia. Meanwhile, and
he's got quite a few ties himself.
Oh, indeed. I mean, we saw him dancing with the Saudi king, and we saw, earlier this year, before the Khashoggi incident, we saw the mainstream media in the United States just, cheering for Saudi Arabia about how modern they were becoming and how great they were doing. They were reforming. They were allowing women to drive. It was just such a great moment. Meanwhile, countries around the Middle East that have a far higher level of human rights, like Syria, for example, with its free elections and multi-religious, different religions participating in the political structure. Iran, where you have, Christians and Sunnis freely practicing their faith alongside the Shia majority, where you have elections. These countries constantly being demonized by U.S. media. But yet Saudi Arabia allows women to drive. At the same time, it's beheading people. At the same time, it's, repressing Shia Muslims. we have the media cheering for Saudi Arabia. But there now seems to be a pretty big divide in the United States. And at this point, Donald Trump is pushing the immigration issue. He's saying he's going to keep the government shut down until he gets funding for his wall, something the Democratic Party is adamant that they are just not going to have. We now are hearing about the deaths of immigrant children in the hands of U.S. Border Patrol. And it's a fight of big proportions. If you turn on your television, you will see in the United States that not in my lifetime. I mean, I'm only 30, but in my lifetime, I've never seen this level of political division. It seems that the elites in the United States, the big corporations, the rich and powerful, the Pentagon, the deep state that people like to talk about, are at odds like never before.
Extraordinary. Now, tell me about this Mueller inquiry. If you believe the media on this side of the ocean, Trump's done for. That this marathon inquiry is closing down on his friends, his family, and ultimately himself. How does that look to you there?
Well, actually, we're seeing the opposite. It was just recently revealed that during the special election in the state of Alabama, there was all this reporting about Russian bots and Russian trolls supporting the Republican candidate. But now, lo and behold, it's been revealed by the New York Times that these weren't Russian bots and Russian trolls. They were actually coming from a cybersecurity firm based in the United States with ties to the Democratic Party called New Knowledge, and that this outfit, New Knowledge, was actually carrying out essentially false flag social media activity to make it look as if the Republican candidate was getting Russian backing. This is big. CNN has made a big point of not trying to run with this story, which is quite interesting. But there's a lot of outrage, and the Bob Mueller investigation has been going on for quite a long time. There have been some individuals who've been arrested for lying to the FBI or failing to register as lobbyists, but ties to Russia, any actual solid ties between Russia and the Trump campaign just haven't surfaced. And it's been quite a long time. Millions of dollars spent, the work of the Justice Department exhausted. We're not seeing anything there. And we have even some of the mainstream voices in the United States, like NPR, National Public Radio, starting to question if there's really, anything there. Is the Bob Mueller investigation going to last much longer? I mean, if at this point all they've got is some people lying to them in interviews, some people not filing the right paperwork, it's starting to look like the whole thing doesn't have anything to it. And a lot of voices are saying that.
Now, what about the Democratic Party? That too seems now to be basically a cleavage has opened up. You've got younger Democratic socialists coming into the Congress, and you've got forces mustering behind another run for the presidency behind Bernie Sanders. And you've got the establishment, if you like, of the Democratic Party worried about both and punting this young fellow from Texas, Beto O'Rourke, as a kind of alternative to Sanders. Mercifully, perhaps, Hillary Clinton seems to have fallen out of the picture as a potential presidential candidate. Tell us how that's all going, would you?
Well, Hillary Clinton hasn't said she's going to run, but she continues to drop little hints that she might do it. She hasn't ruled it out, and there continue to be little hints. But each time there's a lot of just outcry among Democrats because they feel like she's a losing candidate. However, now this individual, Beto O'Rourke, he's from Texas, and he ran against Ted Cruz, who's just, an icon of the Republican Party, a religious conservative evangelical. And it was a close race. And for a Democrat to do that well in Texas is significant. But you have to remember the Democratic Party spent so much money on that race. Usually a Democratic Party race for the Senate in Texas would not be funded that way. But the Democratic Party really just poured lots and lots of money into essentially making Beto O'Rourke into a national figure during that race, even though it was a close race, but he wasn't able to beat Cruz. but they made a point of making him into a national figure, saying that this is a young guy, he's the new face of the Democratic Party. They've compared him to Kennedy. Meanwhile, Bernie Sanders, who is quite old and he's voiced interest in running, and immediately there's just been an outpouring of support for him. And Tulsi Gabbard has also expressed an interest in running, the congresswoman from Hawaii, and she's spoken up about Syria and the U.S. arming of terrorists there, and she's applauded Trump for removing the troops, and she's gotten an outpouring of support as well. And a lot of the rank and file within the Democratic Party, I would say the majority of the rank and file within the Democratic Party, have positions that are similar to that of Bernie Sanders. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party, especially its urban machines, tend to be run by forces that are tied to Hillary Clinton and the Democratic Leadership Council that Hillary Clinton and her husband set up in the late 80s that really kind of parallels New Labour in the UK. It was a very similar operation, moving the party to the right in order to take up and to move into power. It's a very similar parallel. You can compare the Clintons to the Tony Blairs of the United States, really, if you want to think about it.
Well, they were very close, actually. The leaders and their wives were all very close for quite some time. It was one of the great mysteries of the age, how Tony Blair managed to transfer his affections so seamlessly from Bill Clinton to George W. Bush, two very different kinds of politicians.
Well, sure, and it's interesting because there was a real parallel in the rhetoric. Tony Blair came in saying, the world has changed, all this class struggle stuff and the working class. He was pushing all of that aside. Well, the Clintons came in and they said, look, the world has changed, the welfare, the Roosevelt idea, this fighting for the common man stuff. We just need to forget about that. We need to be conservative. We need to be mainstream. We need to just tone it down. And it was a very similar message. And it took, it paralleled what was happening in the world, which was the fall of the Soviet Union and kind of the triumphalism of the voices defending the free market and capitalism around the world. And we saw a shift in political conversation. But what we're seeing now is the opposite. The conversation is shifting once again. People are once again saying, there seems to be a problem with the rule of big banks and corporations around the world, and that there ought to be an alternative, where human needs come first. And Bernie Sanders calls himself a socialist. He advocates an expansion of the welfare state, national health care, free education. But in the United States, the conversation for so long has been, hey, you want some money for health care? Well, you can't do that. That's communism. Hey, you want education to be paid for? You can't do that. That's communism. So you see now the millennial generation that has just heard this tirade of pro-free market propaganda their whole lives, kind of saying, okay, fine. I do want free health care. I do want higher wages. So if that means I'm a socialist, if that means I'm far left, fine. So be it.
Is that what Sanders is offering? I mean, what is Sanders' alternative?
Well, Sanders seems to advocate an expansion of the welfare state. He has said that he doesn't believe in a state-controlled economy, even though his hero is Eugene Debs. He's made clear that he doesn't really advocate, the banks, factories, and industries being controlled by the people, which is the ultimate goal of socialism. But he does advocate that the basic resources be provided for people, that people not just be left to fend for themselves. And that message really hits home with millennials. Who are, facing a far lower standard of living than their parents, and, a low-wage economy, a cycle of short-term, low-wage jobs. It really hits home. Sanders, despite being quite old himself, is quite popular with the youngest people, the people in their 20s.
To call him quite old is an understatement. Isn't he? Wouldn't he be 80 when he became president?
Yeah, indeed, but he's quite popular with the younger folks, and
that is amazing.
Is really hitting home.
Yeah, well, that's the Jeremy Corbyn factor. Also, in England, he's not quite as old as Bernie, but he's very popular amongst young people. I want to ask you finally, and I'm grateful for your time, about a really quite extraordinary. I'd call it absurd, but I found it quite chilling. Statement made that I saw today by your Secretary of State. Mike Pompeo, who he said it's a struggle, everything's a struggle, it will be a struggle, right up to the rapture, capital R. And I got to thinking, these are the kind of people running the United States of America that talk in these terms. The rapture, meaning the end of the world, meaning the battle of Armageddon, meaning the return of the Messiah and the end of the world, the end of times. Is that kind of discourse normal in America? Is there anybody who, like me, thinks, my goodness, that's pretty extraordinary from a man in his position?
Well, it is interesting, and there's a constituency with which that rhetoric is very, very important. I mean, you could look at that and just say it's a figure of speech, but you do have to remember that Mike Pompeo, I believe he's from Kansas, if I'm not mistaken, and that, the evangelical, Baptist, fundamentalist Christian stuff is quite popular among a specific constituency, and that the fact that Trump took Mike Pence as his vice president was definitely a kind of an honor and a gift to that constituency in the United States. And the Bush presidency far, far more was a tie to the evangelical right. It was, you had Bush, himself saying he wasn't sure about Darwin's evolution, that the jury was still out. But Trump, on the other hand, while he does have an alliance with religious conservatives, if you look at his lifestyle, he's not exactly the kind of person that Bible-believing, moral values folks would type to believe in, and that Trump kind of appeals to younger conservatives, maybe younger men that have kind of a resentment against feminism or against the civil rights and African Americans and conversation about white privilege. Trump appeals to a different crowd. So you can see that the Republican Party is kind of shifting, and the evangelical stuff is still very much there, and especially among the forces that are tied with the military and such. That's definitely a factor, but it doesn't have the power it once had during the Bush years.
Extraordinary. Caleb Mopan, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Bob Justice says, on New Year's Day last year, the media ran with the potential of World War III because of North Korea. Can't remember if Pike was Defense Secretary at the time. Do you know, let me just tell you, in parenthesis, that this has passed into popular culture. I think I was the first to liken him to Pike. I certainly was the first to shout, "Don't tell him your name, Pike." Well, I was at my friend Jim Davidson's Care After Combat fundraising dinner in Park Lane some months ago, and Gavin Williamson was at my table. And as he came to sit down, I shouted, "Don't tell him your name, Pike!" And everybody laughed, even the military officers, and even Williamson himself. So, there you go. Just thought I'd tell you that. Anyway, Bob says, on New Year's Day last year, the media ran with the potential of World War III because of North Korea. Can't remember if Pike was Defense Secretary at the time. These Tories are like babushka dolls. They're getting in early with a trade war with China this year. Good luck with that. Exactly, Bob. What could possibly go wrong? And John says Russia's happily signing economic and military legal agreements with China, Syria and Venezuela. That's why the UK and America still aim for regime change. And Mary Mo says, after the Khashoggi murder and the countless murders in Yemen of innocent people, Putin bumping fists with the Saudi prince made me ill. He's also very friendly with Benjamin Netanyahu, just as bad as GM chlorinated Trump. GM chlorinated, that's brilliant. And Kate Mann says the Pezur octopus has many global tentacles. It will be exposed and defeated, but perhaps not in our lifetime, unfortunately. I'm afraid that's above my IQ grade also. Pezur, Payseur. And Scouse Alarm, my old friend up there in Liverpool, says the problem Western governments have with Huawei isn't its mobile phones. It's the network infrastructure they provide, such as phone masts. They seem to think that Huawei will pass on information that goes through their masts to the Chinese government. Let's hear from Chris in Colchester. Chris, welcome.
Hi, George.
Hi.
I'd say well done as well for getting the film through.
Thank you, yeah. It's off and running now.
Yeah, Patrick Henderson gave you a shout-out the other day on the Sunday Wire as well, so I'm sure that helped.
Excellent. He's a good man, Patrick, yeah.
Yeah, no, I always enjoy his show. But I had a quick story about Gavin Williamson as well. I don't know if have you ever seen the show called Pointless?
No, but it sounds like his middle name.
Well, you have to find an answer that no one has got the answer to, so zero, and that's how you win. So it's so obscure that no one's ever heard of him. And the question was, name people in the 2016 cabinet, and he was a pointless answer. And I just thought that it just sums him up brilliantly. He's pointless and no one's heard of him.
And yet he was the chief whip, and they say he's got matinee idol good looks. I can't see that myself. And they say that he's a potential runner for Prime Minister.
God,
the pointless Prime Minister.
Embarrassing.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
And we saw what happened when he was interviewed by Richard Madley.
Richard saw him off the premises.
I know.
Our very own Richard Madeley did what the political journalists never do and said, look, if you're not going to answer me, I'm going to terminate this interview. And Madeley did exactly what he promised he'd do. It was brilliant.
Yeah, no, it's very good. But regarding Trump, actually, I just feel justified, and maybe other people do, that we supported Trump over Hillary Clinton, not because he's an angel or anything, but just because of what she is. And if Hillary Clinton had won, then Syria would now be like Libya, where they have child slave markets in the street and jihadists running around everywhere. But I just want to say well done to the people of Syria for basically winning this war now and celebrating Christmas. It was great to see, even though there was
Santa Claus gambling around in Aleppo, where he would have got his head cut off just 12 months ago or 18 months ago. It's a truly extraordinary transformation.
Despite the Israeli rockets raining down, it was good to see. Apart from that, but I just want to say well done to the people of Syria.
Israel hasn't confirmed they were their rockets, of course. They could have come from, I suppose, Venus or Mars.
Yeah, no, I'm sure. But
okay.
We all know.
Yeah. All right, Chris.
Yeah, well done, George. Have a happy New Year.
And you, sir. Thank you very much for your call. Let's go to John in Birmingham, a first-time caller. John, most welcome.
How are you, sir?
By the grace of God, I'm good, and the better for hearing from you as a first-time caller.
Yes, absolutely. I've been a long-time fan.
Thank you.
And I thought tonight might be the night that I need to have a word with you.
Excellent. Excellent, mate.
Yeah, so basically, George, I wanted to talk about, many times I've heard you guys talking about Brexit, there was always this thought in my head that I thought, Brexit on its own is not a bad thing if you think about it and look at it factually. But at the same time, remaining wasn't the best idea either. Because at the same time for the Brexit, that they came out with those, advertisements and how they kind of introduced themselves, it was quite, non-factual, the £350 million a week and stuff like that. So I would have really preferred the Brexit to be more factual. But at the same time, what happens that people get it wrong? We have two kinds of immigrants, whether they're from Europe or elsewhere, that they come here, they're being law-abiding citizens and they're paying the taxes, and they're being part of the society, and they want to try the hardest to live the best in the country that they like. But on the other hand, we have people who come from Europe, other countries that they're just purely coming here for benefits. You see, I think
I never bought that, John. I never bought that anybody would travel from Eastern Europe or Central Europe to Britain to live on benefits. It's been my experience.
I don't really want to name and shame.
There may be individual cases, of course, but by and large, it's a given. It's an accepted piece of common knowledge that immigrants actually work harder than indigenous populations wherever they go, because partly they want to save up and go back home.
Well, I don't know about going back home, because I've seen, I interacted with a lot of people who came here and genuinely wanted to stay in the country, and they had their lives here, the work, the education, many, many obligations towards the living, that was in this country. And they never thought about, moving on either back home or elsewhere, because this is home for them.
That's true. But, for example, John, the president of Poland has just called on all the Poles in Britain to return to Poland after Brexit. Now, of course, the president of Poland doesn't speak for every Polish person. And I say this as someone who loves Polish people and loves their presence here, filling our churches that would otherwise be half empty and so on. I have absolutely nothing against Poles. Nothing. But I think it's a pity that Polish people are building up Britain when they could be building up Poland. I don't
Absolutely.
see.
I mean,
I just don't see any
George, I'm sure they would have
issue with that.
where they were.
Sorry?
Wouldn't you think? If there were opportunities, back to in their own countries, they would have stayed rather than traveling.
Of course,
to another
that's
country.
right.
You're always traveling and immigrating just because of the hopes that you have in the future.
No, my own antecedents did so because they could get a better life in Scotland, notwithstanding all the bigotry and discrimination that they faced and so on, and the remorseless work in the mills from 6 a.m. till 6 p.m. and a half day on a Saturday. It was better than having stayed back in Ireland. I get that entirely. But there's nothing left-wing about it. The left-wing demand would be to stop occupying Ireland, help Ireland to develop so that Irish people can live and work in Ireland without having to take to the seas in their bare feet as immigrants. Am I not right?
Well, I think this whole idea of immigration has been in the society for many and thousands of years.
Yeah, sure.
People have moved on from country to countries just so you can, live better, because of certain criteria. So thinking about immigration is a newly made up term, I think is quite impulsive because it's always been in the history. You're looking at, you take in the monarchies' backgrounds, and you see that they have come from many different countries.
Well, the royal family came. The royal family came from different countries. But let me ask you, John. Let me ask you: are you in favour of open borders, of allowing anyone to emigrate anywhere they want at any time?
See, I think remaining in a country without giving benefits is false, regardless of whether you're a British elsewhere, living elsewhere, or a European, or I don't know, wherever you are from, living in the country. If you don't have a benefit, it's not a good step for anybody, for either parties. Having open borders, to some extent, it should be allocated to people. In what world would I imagine myself, traveling to different countries if I didn't have the rights to travel to them? And if the borders were harder for me to apply for a visa, it would have been, much harder to go to different countries for holidays or whatnot. So I think that's the important aspect of the Brexit, that we need to take control of our borders. But at the same time, it would have been much better decision made behind the Brexit if the facts were correct. If we had a study for a year or two that these are the consequences of Brexit, so we wouldn't have, given this option to people to say, whether you want to stay, remain, or you want to use go through a Brexit, without actually giving the facts that these are the things that might happen. You've got to pay.
Anyway, I mean, not just because of the hour. I just need to make the point that, of course, that argument is now gone. The referendum took place. People made the decision. The decision will now be implemented in 91 days and 25 minutes. And that's how close we are. That we are leaving the EU. So in a way, John, these arguments are all too late. Thanks, though, for the call. Let's hear from Paddy in Glasgow. Go ahead, Paddy.
George, hail, hail.
Hail, hail to you. Big weekend for us.
Yes. Yeah, what's your prediction tomorrow, George?
Celtic will win 3-1.
Yes, yeah, and I think it'll be. It should be comfortable.
I mean, Rangers have improved, of course, and Steven Gerrard definitely got them playing better, particularly in Europe. But Celtic will have too much for them, I think.
Yeah, Brendan's got the way of things.
I'm slightly surprised he's still there. I thought he'd have been back in the Premiership in England by now. Still believe he will, but there you go. Anyway, this is not Talk Sport.
No, indeed.
You could ring Mike Parry, whose birthday it is today, I must say. He's the same age as me. Can you believe that?
Well, he sounds just as sprightly.
Yes, he has. He's broadcast his birthday. Anyway, Paddy, go on.
Yeah, well, actually, you have mentioned Huawei quite a few times tonight, and it just brought back memories of 2012. I was in Erbil, a lovely part of Iraq, and around about 2012, and I had a meeting with some of the top brass there.
Some of the Kurdish top brass?
No, it's from the Chinese.
Oh, Chinese, I beg your pardon.
The Huawei had an office in Irbil when I was trying to drum up business.
Did they? Yeah.
And they were quite keen on, they had a contract with the Iraqi government to install the telephone masts right across Iraq, and they were quite keen on being able to store the equipment somewhere safe.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem the problem I had with all the bases that we had offices at, we had that facility where we're also within a green zone, within the sort of American controlled.
Yes.
So that
and they wouldn't let them in. They wouldn't let the Chinese in.
Well, they thought of trying to put that across to the Americans to let them store telecommunications equipment from a Chinese company. I thought, I think I'm going to have to pass up on that. But George, what I did want to ask you is just on Brexit. Something that's concerned me is, what do you think is going to be the short to middle term sort of effect on jobs?
No doubt there will be dislocation, there will be turbulence. It's leaving without a deal, which now looks like the most likely thing. Is not a walk in the park, but as has been said by others, neither is it the end of the world. For a start, means we don't have to pay the EU any of that divorce settlement, and that'll be quite a tidy bonus for us. But in the medium term, I think things will be fine. Some sectors will suffer, and some sectors will benefit. I want more self-reliance in this country. I want us to make more things that we used to make and that we need.
I would love to see that too, but I mean, do you not think realistically? I mean, if, for instance, it's a Conservative government, are we not just going to be a kind of pawn within sort of American administration?
Well, governments are here today, gone tomorrow, Paddy, and the next election cannot be long delayed. Indeed, it might be sooner than you think. And we'll get the government that we vote for. If we re-elect the Tories, then that's what we'll get, and we'll deserve it, because that's what happens in a democracy. But I've got faith in the British people. I believe it's a 1945 moment, and I believe that Jeremy Corbyn is a Clement Attlee figure.
Well, I hope you're right. I'd love,
Well, do your bit. Do your bit in Glasgow, because the big weakness in the Labour team at the moment, I'm afraid, is in Scotland. Paddy, thanks very much for that call. Much more where that came from after this. Norma, welcome.
Hello, George.
Hi.
I only wanted to make a few comments. I mean, to be honest, my IQ is not as high as some of the speakers, but I do learn a lot from listening. I really do. Last New Year's Day, my husband and I, as you may remember, we were both rushed to hospital with pneumonia and bad chest infection, and it was really bad for 2 or 3 months. But this year, on New Year's Day, we do listen. It's very posh, actually, to this concert that comes from Vienna.
Mm-hmm.
It's very uplifting, actually. At the end of it, I always sort of look forward to the rest of the year. And having missed it last year, we're looking forward. But I do hope for you that this year, next coming up, will be as interesting as your programs for this year, because, you must be here to stay, George. My life just wouldn't be the same.
Well, if God spares me, I'm not going anywhere other than here. We don't know what lies ahead. There are sharks in the water, and we don't know what will happen. But one way or another, you'll be able to hear me, Norma. I give you that promise.
Great. And just do worry what on earth's going to happen with Brexit. It is a very... Well, we just wait and see.
It's an exciting time, Norma.
Yeah, it can be, yeah.
Look on it as a brief Dunkirk followed by a Normandy landing, except that landing will be all over the world. That's how I'd look at it.
Hopefully, George.
Thank you. Then. God bless you, Norma, and your husband. Let's hear from Leonora in the London area. Go ahead, Leonora.
Oh, hello. Yes, I was just phoning because of something that you said just a little while ago about the
divorce settlement.
Divorce settlement,
yes.
Because I understood that the money that we were paying was for obligations that had already begun.
Only a small part of it. Maybe 5 billion, maybe 10. Nothing like 40.
Oh, I see. Oh, okay. Oh, because I was worried about that. I thought, we have to pay our...
It was extortion, Leonora. It was basically, and this is one of my many criticisms over the negotiators. They should have negotiated that point last. If I was going into management as a trade union negotiator, I would have dealt with the thing that my interlocutor wanted most last, so that he had an incentive to settle with me on all the other things first.
Well, I agree with you that it hasn't exactly, been negotiated with any vigour, but I was concerned that we should pay that which we'd already agreed to contribute to before we said we were going to leave, because... Well,
I can think of a lot of things we need to do with that 40 billion rather than give it to the bloated bureaucracy of the EU.
I agree.
So I'd be paying as little.
Owe it and that we hadn't already agreed.
This is basically a compensation payment to them. Of course, there are some things that are legally enforceable, but others definitely not. God bless you, Leonora. Have a happy New Year. Let me hear from the legend that is Damien in Brighton. Damien, welcome.
Good evening, George.
I'm so happy to close the year talking with you. You talk such sense.
Well, I hope I can again this evening, George. George, I wanted to make a point regarding the China question.
Yes.
So a topical question in international relations is whether China can rise peacefully. But I'm not sure that we're asking the right question, George, because if we look at post-World War II history, we can clearly see that America does not tolerate peer states.
Mm-hmm.
So if that is the case, and it clearly, historically, the evidence shows it is, then that means that China will not be allowed to rise peacefully by America.
The question is, can it be stopped, Damien?
Exactly, George, and that was what was going to bring me on to my point. Now, I think there's a couple of factors which mean that it's completely unsustainable for America to continue with its offensive, realist foreign policy, which is basically regularly engaging in wars of aggression. That policy is destabilizing regions. America's refusing to follow international laws and norms, and that means that its allies and other countries are given a green light to say that they don't have to either. Now, the cost of that, I believe America spent $6 trillion since 2001 on wars. At the same time, 30 million Americans do not have health care cover, and half of the American workforce earns less than $30,000 a year. So
that's an amazing statistic.
It is, George. So I think there's internal pressures and external pressures, because we're also seeing the rise, as well as China, Russia, India, South America. And by 2065, third world countries' economies as a total will be larger than first world countries' economies as a total. So it's completely unsustainable position that the Americans have got. And my point of this, George, is that it's an unsustainable position, and the first president who recognises that position is unsustainable and starts cutting down on the amount of wars. America's currently engaged in 8 wars, serious military theatres, and the first president who delivers the peace dividend to the American people from withdrawing from that number of aggressive wars is going to be a very popular president indeed, George.
Well, let's hope it's Bernie Sanders. Damien, thank you for that call. Let's hear from John in Nottingham. Go ahead, John.
Hi, George.
Hi there.
Good to see you in Nottingham. Meet you on Kent. It was a great show.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it was a good show. Yeah, we're in Neath on the 26th of January and Birmingham on the 27th of January. I hope they're as good. Go ahead, John.
George, after Brexit, Is the deep state structuring a conflict between Russia and China so as we don't trade with them after Brexit? Are we going to be sent into the clutches of the USA the big corporations?
Well, anybody who was a policymaker who wanted to have only one friend in the world would deserve to be locked up in care because there's something wrong with them. The whole point about leaving the European Union is so we can rejoin the world. We're slipping our moorings in the European Union and sailing free. And that's the kind of Britain I want to see. If we end up just being the 51st state of the United States, that could only be because that we elected governments that wanted that. I don't believe we will.
I hope not. I hope we don't sail from the EU straight into the USA. I think that would be a bad thing.
Well, it would be a very bad thing, yeah. I like the USA and I like American people. I've got American blood in my veins myself. I've just been talking about Motown all night. I mean, I want to have good relations with America, but it's never a good idea just to have one mate, is it?
No, and I'm thinking more the aggressive capitalist corporations that could be a bad thing for
yeah, of course we'll have a capitalist future until we decide to have something else. John, thanks very much for the call. I need to get through some of the written material. My apologies if you didn't get through. Many people were trying. There's just not enough time on one show a week. Neil Salter says, often a government's foreign and war policy is a domestic propaganda measure. Thatcher and the Falklands, she was in trouble before that. The Tories are scared of Corbyn. They want to create enemies, Russia, China, so the electorate reach for the right. Graham in Fort William says, George, I can't call tonight. I've got a chest infection. Talk to you next year. You do a great show. I love the banter. No harm meant. I hope you have a great new year and all the best for 2019. Same to you, Graham, in Fort William. Thank you very much for that nice message. Mal says, I think that Trump and Putin have connections in how Trump came to power. I also think that Trump wants to be friendly with Russia, but the American establishment won't let him. So he has to be seen to be strong against them. Britain needs to be friends with the rest of the world and not be brought into and getting involved with other countries' trade wars that use the possible threat of military wars as an ever-increasing bargaining chip. Good point, Mal. And Philza, my dear friend in Ireland, says, what a text from Graham. Ha ha, my God, George, I was missing the humorous touch, but Graham made me laugh for long. I love how people love listening to you, even when they disagree. Agree or disagree, can't resist listening to you. Height of success, Gigi. Thank you, dear Philza. And Kate Mann says, I can't believe the insults of your previous texter. I'm happy to admit I admire Trump, and I wish we had him instead of May. Thank you, Kate, for that. Bob says, it was inevitable the dragon in the east would rise. Anyone else under the impression that all the Western corporations that rushed east for cheap labour sold us down the Swanee never really gets a mention. Has Pike just declared a trade war against them? And P. Doff says Gatwick disabled for days by a drone, and then a few days later Gatwick is sold. That is indeed a mystery. Whoever bought it? I've got a bridge here in London. The French brought Gatwick. My goodness. Chris says, I agree that we are in the pre-apocalypse times now. The reason I believe that is that Western attitudes have changed from fighting against sin to actively promoting sin. I just cannot see the world surviving in this wicked atmosphere for much longer. Oh, cheer up, Chris. Russell Davis says, GG on Talk Radio reminds us unfettered knowledge and common sense still exists where the others are lost to the filth of political pantomime. And Mark Challoner says Poland now has 1 million Ukrainians working there for peanuts, George. Does the Polish president think his own citizens are going to return for peanuts? Do me a favour. And Mal, sometimes some of the very smart and skilled people, often all countries of the world, are life's travellers who go emigrating across this world towards their dreams. And sometimes they stay put, never wanting to leave, and build their lives from whence they came. Sorry if I didn't get to your text, your email, or your tweet. Sorry if you didn't get through. It's been marvellous for me. I hope it was for you. And why not play some Tamla Motown sometime over this weekend? I promise you, you'll love rediscovering the gems of Motown. The great Ian Lee is up next. Apparently he's not. I've misled you. It's Tommy, my old pal. You know, Tommy and I used to hand over to each other back in 2006. That's how long I've been here. Let's hope I'm here another 13 years. Have a happy new year, each and every one of you.